So really lovely to see you, Joyce. I'm very glad to be joining you for this interview today. And it's, you're a legend in the field, so it's very nice to have some time together. So you're, as you know, a professor in reproductive science at the Institute for Women's Health at UCL. And you've got a very long career, and you've got a very extremely extensive network in the field. So I think you'd be the perfect person to talk to about basically what our project is about, which is how fertility is changing in the world today at many different levels. So at the sort of conceptual level, how do we think and talk and educate about fertility, but also how is the sector organized and how is that changing? And also what kind of technologies for fertility are appearing and disappearing in today's world, and how do we navigate that as scholars and women and patients and so on. So I thought it might be nice to start a little bit with your own story. So could you share how you got involved in the reproductive science field and the reproductive medicine field? Do you know, when did it start for you, and what motivated you to go in this direction?
So thank you very much, Lucy, for agreeing to interview me as well, because we always have wonderful conversations, and I'm sure we're going to have a wonderful conversation today. So I was finishing my PhD in 1987, and that fertility then was very, very new. So we all know Louise Brown was born in 1978. So it was, just relatively few years after Louise Brown was born. And I always admit that the way I started in this field was my PhD was not related to fertility at all. It was on tissue culture of cells. And I felt that I wanted to slightly change field. So I really was just sitting there in the library looking through New Scientist. In those days, we just had a paper copy. And I saw a job advert for an embryologist. And I immediately jumped out at me, and I was absolutely fascinated. And I thought, I've got to do this amazing new field that was starting. So I applied for the job and got the job. And so after my PhD for 5 years, just over 5 years, I worked as a clinical embryologist in the IVF lab. And I started with one clinic and for various reasons moved to another clinic where I stayed for almost 5 years. So it was a wonderful introduction to this very new, controversial, dynamic field. But after 5 years, I really realized that my passion was research and teaching. And I had always wanted to do those two. That had always been my prime aim. And what had happened was that I was now working in a clinic where things are very routine and there is not scope to do very, very little research and education. So my boss who ran the clinic wanted me to manage the whole clinic. And that wasn't really where I wanted to go. So I was under 30. I had an office and lab in Harley Street. You think, that's it, you've made it. But I felt that I felt there was nowhere else for me to go really in that embryology sphere at that time, and that I really needed to get back to academia. So then I went and joined the Hammersmith team to work on pre-implantation genetic testing.
How exciting, how exciting. When very early on, when we started the previous project at Cambridge, we had a session on what did Bob Edwards see when he looked through the microscope and saw the embryo. I'm wondering, what did you see when you started working in embryology and you saw the embryos? What did it, and all the other reproductive cells, what did it signify to you? Why did it get you excited at the time?
It was just absolutely amazing. I had always assumed when I was doing my undergrad and my PhD that I was going to be working in a field that helped cure people's illnesses, which obviously is a situation where sometimes you don't cure their illnesses. And so there is normally a lot of death and a lot of clinical research. And here we were looking at life, which is really not where I thought I was going to be. And it was just absolutely astounding that you had the eggs and the sperm in the dish and then made an embryo, help make an embryo. And then 9 months later, people had a baby, and it was just amazing. And when your first babies that you were involved with helping, you know, when you came into the clinic and you met them, it was just unbelievable. I specifically remember the first baby I met who I'd done an embryo biopsy on for PGT. You know, then I had really manipulated that embryo and taken some of the cells out. And then when they brought the baby in, I was absolutely overcome, and just couldn't believe it. So that help for infertile couples. Obviously, you do get people that don't succeed. So there is a negative side, obviously, to it. But helping people have a family is really so amazing. It's unbelievable. And seeing those embryos in a dish and thinking, you have to distance yourself. You mustn't think too much about it on a day-to-day basis. But it is amazing that this little ball of cells is going to make a baby, and you're looking at it.
Yeah, well, fantastic. And then you said you moved on to focusing on pre-implantation genetic screening or diagnosis. What motivated that move, and what was your experience there?
I felt that, again, it was very new. I started working in that field in 1992, and the first births have been 1989. So again, it was a new field. It just seemed so cutting edge, brought in my interest of looking at diseases and obviously genetic diseases. So it was something that was really exciting, and obviously a place where you could absolutely do academic research. There obviously has been research on human embryology over the decades, but it's very difficult. It's very difficult ethically, very difficult getting samples. And obviously with PGT, we did still do some research on human embryos, but there were so many other aspects that we could look at. It was just a really dynamic field, and just seemed the obvious place for me to go to try and get that academic interest really blossoming.
Yeah, amazing. So, and I think in a way you're still working on that topic as well, right? I mean, over the years you've published a lot on pre-implantation genetic testing in all its different varieties. So I think there has been a long journey with you and this technology over the last couple of decades. How would you characterize that journey?
It's been fraught, actually, with issues. This whole field, IVF, PGT, everything it is controversial. So there's been a lot of controversies over the years. So you mentioned the three different terms. We've called it screening, we've called it diagnosis, we've called it testing. They're all slightly different definitions, but it's for me, the initial draw had been to help patients who were at risk of transmitting a genetic disease, which is either diagnosis or testing. But then the commercialization of the technology really came in the mid-90s with the screening. So the screening being for any person going through fertility treatment, doing a test to check if their embryos are chromosomally normal or not. And even today, so I've been really plugging over these years that we need to practice evidence-based medicine, we need to do research. So this started in 1995, we're now in 2022, and there is still no compelling evidence that this screening is of benefit to the majority of patients going through fertility treatment, but it's now embedded in many clinics' treatments and is what we call one of these IVF add-ons. And through that work on the pre-implantation genetic screening, it really got me involved in the broader picture of IVF add-ons, and the campaign really to try and make sure that we give patients the correct information and ideally encourage people to do research to get evidence to show one way or another that these treatments do actually work. But we've been decades in the pre-implantation field and we don't have compelling evidence. So as a result, we've had hundreds of thousands of patients go through these treatments, pay lots of money for these treatments with no evidence that it's actually going to help their treatment or their outcome. So that's been the real controversial part for me. And that's really, to be honest, it's given me a lot of pain over the years and tears. and lots of arguments with colleagues who some of us don't agree. Some of us feel that this is a valid procedure and we should be doing it for every IVF patient. And I'm definitely on the other side thinking that, well, all these decades, we don't have evidence to show that this is going to benefit people, and we're offering it routinely. And that doesn't sit comfortably with me.
Yes, I understand. And at the same time, it's interesting that you are, you're telling me you've experienced tears and conflict and lots of difficulties, and yet you remain passionate and interested in this topic and in the field and so on. So what drives you to, or what makes you so motivated to put yourself on the line and to keep working on this?
That's a good question. To be honest, in recent years now, I have moved much more for about the last 8 years, moved much more to educating the public, not just about whether fertility treatments work or not, but even the broader picture of understanding their fertility. And this was actually something that I'd been very, very interested in when I first started in IVF. So IVF being a new field, there were all of us working in the field, we weren't experienced at this, and we were normally trained just on hoof, in the lab. Someone else taught you something and then you carried on, but we didn't really learn the theory of what we did, which always worried me. And I've done some work there in helping to train embryologists, but helping the public understand what we're doing really has been a wider picture. So back in 1987, when I started working in embryology, I did learn so much because I obviously read as much as I could. And my friends at that time, who were, whether they were doing science or not, when I used to go out and say, oh, yeah, this is about fertility and your fertile window and getting pregnant, and they said, we don't know that. And I thought, well, I didn't know that before I did it. So I actually started writing a book in 1987 to try and help my girlfriends understand how their menstrual cycle worked, how contraception worked, etc. And there'd only been one book at that time called Our Body, Ourselves, which was an American book. Great book, but I wanted to write an English version. But when you're young, life disappears very quickly. And the next thing, it's 25 years later. So I did publish the book last year, and it is on fertility from the menstrual cycle through to the menopause, and a bit about the future of how we might reproduce in the future. So in more recent years, I now don't do any lab work at all. So I was a pure lab scientist for decades. But maybe it's a midlife crisis. I have felt that I needed to shift over slightly. So now my work is really based more around fertility education. So I helped co-found the UK Fertility Education Initiative back in 2016. And then a few years ago, we've set up an international multidisciplinary group called the International Fertility Education Initiative. And through there, we want to do research, find out how we can teach people, what we should teach people. So this last academic year, I've been going into lots of schools, teaching school children about the menstrual cycle right through to the menopause. And also we're doing a survey of school children. It's been also done in Belgium and Greece to find out what adolescents think about having children. Do they want children? You always get the impression that they don't, but when you ask them, they do. Most of them, large proportion, do. So yeah, those discussions around how we can help educate the public have really now become much more important to me. Now I've stopped doing the lab work on PGT, and PGT now is almost totally commercialized. So if you're doing a diagnostic test, you're normally part of a company. So our academic unit that we had at UCL for decades shut a few years ago, but now moving over to the work, asking the public how we can help educate them is really a wonderful evolution of my career, and I'm just so passionate about this and love it. But it's still controversial. We still have some tears along the way, but I think, yeah, that's life. So We don't all agree. People are never all going to agree, and it's great to hear other opinions and think about these things.
So where do the tears come from? What are the controversies that you encounter?
There's many. The one example is that female fertility declines in a woman's 30s, and the pivotal age we always talk about is age 35. And we do have to understand all the data for natural conception or IVF conception is that the chance of getting pregnant in your 40s is very low. And by the age of 43, 44, it's very, very small. And by 45, almost all women will be infertile, no matter how they try to have children. But it really starts at 35 and will make it very difficult for a lot of women. So there are some people who feel that this is a lie and it's not true, and we're being anti-feminist. And you know, anyone that knows me, well, that doesn't fit my description. And that, yeah, I've been trolled on Facebook. There was one woman that listened to one of my webinars saying that, and she kept copying in my university and saying that they needed to sack me and that I was a liar. And so, you know, there are controversies along the way for sure. And that's just one example. And this has happened in many, many countries. People have been told that the educators have been told that what they're saying is trying to force women to get pregnant quicker and not to develop their careers or their social life, and that we're just doing it to add to the patriarchy. And we're absolutely not. We want to give women the evidence-based information so they can make the choice, but we can't go against decades of data, and we have to take that on board. So yeah, there's still controversy. I thought there would be less in fertility education, but it's still there.
Yeah, I can imagine, because it's interesting that there's different movements happening in fertility education, in the sense that on the one hand you have a lot of women who say, gosh, I didn't know about this fertility decline, and I wish I'd known this, so I would have made different choices. And on the other hand, you also have now a younger cohort of women, say in their 20s, who get, you know, marketed for fertility testing and checking if they still have enough time. And, you know, I have students at 24 who are concerned about, am I still going to be fertile? Do I need to get tested, and so on? So it's a very interesting double movement, that on the one hand, you want to make sure that everybody knows, and on the other hand, you also don't want to unnecessarily worry people, especially if they're quite young. Now, how do you navigate those two things together?
Yes, you've hit a couple of things right on the head there. So if we look at egg freezing, the work of the International Fertility Education is we want to prevent some people going to a fertility clinic. I had 7 years of fertility treatment to have my children, and it's a very, very painful process to go through physically and emotionally. And I don't want people to have to do that. So giving them the information about fertility decline is really important to me for that reason, to prevent them going, because if some of them had children younger, they wouldn't be in the clinic, or if they were a bit more aware about STIs or whatever, that we could prevent some infertility. And I absolutely don't want to hear, which we do hear a lot, why did no one teach me this? Which is very, very common, really common phrase. But then the fertility testing is a real problem for me. And it's a very, very hot topic. There are numerous companies that will offer young women a check of their hormones, a few of their hormones, and will say that this is a fertility test. But there really is no fertility test, no evidence-based fertility test. Some of the hormones they look at, well, number one, it's just a snapshot on that day. So the next week, your hormones could be totally different. But also another main point is that it takes two to make a baby. So it depends on the fertility of your partner. And we all know cases where two people have got pregnant really easily, and then they separate, and then they can't get the next person pregnant. You know, there needs to be that needs to work between two people. So you can't just look at the woman and blame the woman. I think, if anything, this is, you know, not a good thing. Where the fertility test is, it's all about the woman, and it's not all about the woman. So we need the partner there for sure. But the biggest problem is that with these fertility tests is that if your results are good result, would the clinic really tell you you're okay, you've got 5 years left, you've got 10 years left? They can't tell you that. And if it's a bad result, then that woman is going to be devastated that she might never have children. And the data out there, and there's numerous papers on this, have shown that women with a bad result can still get pregnant naturally. And those with a good result might not be able to get pregnant, might have infertility. So the trouble with doing a test when the data, well, when the result of the test is, number one, not backed up by data, but number two, the advice of that test, whatever the result, is not really concrete. In my view, that's not helpful. It just confuses any woman. Now, there are women where we could pick up something really important, like total premature ovarian failure, where the ovaries have stopped. There's polycystic ovarian syndrome, there's other issues, but there are other ways that we can do that. If we educate women about their menstrual cycle, so if they're not having a relatively regular cycle, or if they're having a very painful period, they should know that that's not normal and that they need to get checked. So when I go into schools, I tell them, if you're having a very painful period, please go and see someone. Women should not be suffering and thinking, oh, it's one of those things, we need to just deal with it. We don't. We should go and see someone as soon as possible. Yeah, there's always this data that endometriosis takes years to diagnose, and this is where you get really painful periods. And part of that is because we don't speak up enough. We should be there at the doctor, hounding them, do some tests, get some things done, get to the bottom of why I'm experiencing this huge pain. And if a woman's got a very irregular cycle, that does have an effect on her fertility, but it may have effects on other important aspects of her life. So even if you're a young woman who doesn't want children or doesn't want children yet, and you're having an irregular cycle, I've suggested to them that they might still want to go and get that checked to find out, is her ovary stopping? Has she got polycystic ovarian syndrome? What is it that's causing a regular cycle? So the education is so important. So I'm not a fan of the fertility test. I think it's just complicating it for many women. We can't say you've got 5 years left, you've got 10 years left. Most of the women that go and have it done would be in their early 30s. And the advice to anyone in their early 30s is, if you want children, you need to think about it sooner rather than later. And then they make their decision. So doing a test is really confusing it, in my view.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for adding that nuance and navigating that. And, it's just striking how many tests are available today. Like, I was at the fertility show yesterday, and there were many different companies offering tests. Just walking through London, where I'm based, and you too with your work, there are many campaigns as well. So it's becoming a very visual part of how people who are not undergoing IVF might encounter the fertility sector in terms of advertising, in terms of what they might find online and so on. So it's quite striking how it broadens the group of people who might get acquainted with the fertility sector in a way that maybe wasn't the case 10 years ago. So when we go to the question of, say, patients and people who come for fertility treatment, or maybe even for testing, or who come in through the doors of a fertility clinic, would you say that group has changed over the last couple of decades as well, compared to when you were starting and now?
They certainly have changed. When I was working in the IVF lab, I helped run the ethics committee. At that time, we were not allowed to treat any single women. I can remember several single women, their cases went to the ethics committee and they were rejected. They couldn't be treated. It felt it wasn't right to do that. And obviously same-sex couples was, I can remember us giving a same-sex female couple some syringes, and me standing in the corridor explaining to them how they could go and with their friend who was donating the sperm, how they could go and have a child. And obviously the whole non-binary and trans community as well. It's something that we weren't allowed to do back then, and now we can, and it's really important. And we're doing a lot of work with the LGBT community, and something that's really important for the non-binary and trans community is for them, well, for all of them to understand how, if they want to have children, how they can have children. I have a few, obviously quite a lot of gay friends who are my age, and I've asked them in the past, but they all told me they didn't want children. I said, do you, one particular conversation was a guy, and I said, do you think you didn't want children because you assumed as a gay man you couldn't have a child when you were young, so you sort of blocked it out? And do you think if you were told this at school, then you could have children? Do you think you might have had a different mindset? He said, yeah, I probably would, but back 30 years ago, you just thought, I can't have children. You just shut that down. So again, back to the education, it's really important when I go into schools, I make sure that I do explain to the LGBT kids that they can absolutely have children, and what they need to think about. And then non-binary and trans that may have any hormonal or surgical treatment, that there's important things they need to know. So they might want to freeze their eggs or their sperm before they have any treatment, because most of the treatments will make them infertile. But there are absolutely options open to them to have a family if they want to have a family. And I think that's reassuring to lots of people to know that that option's still there. So I think that's the biggest change for me, that now we can treat single women, we can treat the LGBT community. I can remember the very first day I can't remember if the trans man or trans woman came in as a couple with somebody, and everyone in the clinic said, what do? We don't know what to do. It was, and that was a long time ago. That was 30 years ago. And so it's great now that it's out there, and we can help and educate, and people can have a family if they want one.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for doing that work. I want to mention the work of Robert Pralat, who's one of the researchers in ReproSoc, who has done work both on the views of adolescents who are LGBT identified, and their views on whether they want to have children or not, as well as the views of HIV positive gay men who now also have opportunities to have children, and how they navigate that. So yeah, that's for any people watching who are interested in this topic. Do check that out alongside your work, of course. So great. So one other thing that I think would be important to address is how the organization of the sector has changed, and particularly in the last 10 years, there have been more outside investors into IVF and the fertility sector more broadly. So that includes private equity investors, to a lesser degree, venture capital for startups. We've seen a lot of clinics grow significantly or merge into larger national and international groups. I was wondering, how do you see this development, and do you remember when that kind of started and how it's changed over the years?
Yes, I do remember when it happened. So when I was working in IVF, the clinics were all there were private clinics, obviously, but they were set up by an individual, a clinician who wanted to set up a clinic. And then there was obviously then NHS clinics that were set up in a very similar way. And there were still controversies at that time about people maybe starting IVF too early, and it was the money, and the clinics, the private clinics did become very wealthy, for sure. And then the controversy started in Sydney when the Sydney clinic was put on the stock market, and then huge sums of money came into play. And I think that really shook the world up, and they thought about how much money IVF could generate and profit. So that has escalated, in my view, out of control now. So in the study that you and I have did a few years ago, looking at the fertility clinics websites, we showed how many clinics were now part of a group. And there was, I think when we wrote that paper, one clinic, there were two clinic chains that only had 6 clinics. As far as I'm aware, one of those now has I think it was 14 at last count. So it's just being sucked up into bigger and bigger corporations, and the venture capitalists are loving to put money in this. There's clinics being sold. I heard the last one was 110 million. You know, it's crazy money, and there's so many reasons why I feel uncomfortable. But one reason is, where does the profit come from in an IVF clinic? It comes from the infertile patients who are going through the treatment. So the treatment now is hugely expensive. There are all these companies now that offer you cheaper treatment if you pay for 2 upfront, and all these sorts of things, and get your money back if you don't get pregnant, and you know, all these sort of loan companies, loan sharks, if you like. But they make me feel uncomfortable as well. It's sort of gambling with someone's fertility treatment. But the treatment is now out. The cost is crazy. It's so expensive, and so expensive compared to many European countries. And many European countries, for example, Belgium, they fund 6 cycles. Everyone has 6 cycles. So this is why this problem's happened in the UK and other countries, where the government funds very few cycles. Then the commercialization just grows exponentially. And now we're in this situation where there's lots of people who have no access to IVF because they can't afford it, which I think is criminal. And that really, you know, breaks my heart. I know some people close to me who haven't been able to afford these huge fees, and so haven't even tried to have fertility treatment. So we're getting all high tech with these shiny labs with all this technology in it and AI all over the place, etc., which just bumps up the costs even more. Huge amounts of profits being made. And one of my sayings is, I think we should be making families, not making money. I know it's easy for an academic to say, but I think I think we're doing a real injustice to our patients. And if we had more access, that everyone has at least 2 cycles or 3 cycles, ideally, then I would feel less concerned about it. But the fact that we have thousands of people every year who don't have fertility treatment because they can't afford it, I think is really wrong.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm wondering, when you listen to a lot of the people who work in the larger companies, they say, you know, by having a larger scale operation, we are trying to make the treatments more accessible. We're trying to make it cheaper by automating and thereby cutting costs, by doing economies of scale and thereby making things more affordable. Is that your experience? Would you say that is indeed the case, or do you have a different experience from that?
I keep being told that.
Yeah.
I keep being told that AI, for example, will make it cheaper, and this will make it cheaper. You know, they say when you buy something new, well, certainly when I was young, if you bought something new, eventually it would become cheaper at some point as the technology got cheaper. But I think nowadays that doesn't happen. If we think about our phone and our watches and things, did any of them get cheaper? I don't think they got cheaper. They got more expensive. And it's the same thing happening with IVF. I haven't seen anyone dropping prices. I must admit, I don't check prices regularly, but from what I'm being told, it's just got more and more expensive. It's not got any cheaper. So if that would happen, that would be great. But at the moment, IVF costs are really astronomical.
Right. And linked to that, I think one of your most interesting studies, among many interesting studies, are the one that you wrote with Theobald on the differences between the use of PGT in the UK and in the US. Is this also the reason why you think there is such a big discrepancy? Or maybe for the viewers, you can explain what you published about that. But how would you compare US and UK IVF?
So US is obviously much more commercialized, and the cost of IVF in the US is even much more than ours. And so PGT, for example, the follow-on paper we did from that, we found out that there were then 3 clinics that did PGT for example, in every single patient. So this is a method that's never been shown to be of benefit to patients, but it's being done in every single cycle, because then you add more money on to obviously pay for the genetic screening of the embryos. So when we wrote the Theobald paper, we looked at over certain years, we looked at the amount of IVF and PGT in the US and in the UK, and we found it hugely different. So the UK at that time, there was only about 2% of cycles were doing pre-implantation genetic testing. And in the US, I can't remember the final figures we did on that, but it was in the 20s overall. And then we followed that on with a paper just looking at the US. And if you looked at every year, the percent of PGT in relation to IVF was going up and up and up. And now it's still going up. I do believe that if we repeated the Theobald paper now in the UK, we would see a very, very different picture. I have been told there are clinics that are doing PGT on almost every case now in the UK. So even though the Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority, I helped, I was advisor to the committee that set up this traffic light system for patients to understand these IVF add-ons. And a red rating meant that there was no evidence that this technology would improve their chance of having a baby. And PGT originally, or PGT for aneuploidy screening is what we call it. But this screening was originally given an amber, which meant there was some evidence. But then with further studies, more recent studies, it changed to red. But there's still a growing number of clinics that offer this procedure. And part of it, as you and I have found, part of it is because if patients Google information about these technologies, it looks amazing. It will definitely help them have a baby. It will, increase their or decrease their time to pregnancy. They'll get pregnant quicker. They'll have less miscarriages. They'll have a better chance of having a baby at the end. And that's what's out on the web, but that's not what the papers have found. And that information gets twisted along the way. So if you were told, if you read this and on the internet from what you thought were reliable sources, you would absolutely want to do it. You think, yes, I'll do that. It's going to improve my chance. And you want to do everything you can to improve your chance. But that's not what the actual papers say.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's interesting in that respect. You also mentioned the HFEA. Do you think that beyond the traffic light system, that the regulator can play a role in turning the tide or changing this around?
So the HFEA does have limited powers, unfortunately. So there are some things they can't do. They can regulate, but one of the issues were with a new technology, they either have to approve it or disapprove of it. So what they needed to do really was have a research phase. So there could be some new treatments that could go into a research holding area, if you like, where while data was being gathered to see whether it worked, then it couldn't be charged for, and it couldn't just be rolled out across the board. But they don't have it in their act to do that. And also, the only way they can ban a new treatment is to do with safety. It's not to do with efficacy. So again, I think they should build that in, that if they've got a technique that's totally safe but doesn't help, I mean, to me that's crazy. But that's how they were confined at this moment in time. So with regarding to the advertising, they did get the Competitions Market Authority on board. But I don't know if you've had a look recently. I've had a look at some websites and they're still saying information that's not correct. So it's very hard to police this. It's very, very hard. And it's big business, and the clinics have lots of money. And there have been some court battles, and it's been very, very difficult for the HFEA. So, and also we are more governed than any other country in the world. Should we be even more governed, or should clinicians be able to decide what they want to do? I don't know, somewhere in between. But I think the root of our problem is that we don't fund enough cycles. If we funded more cycles, some of this would not matter. Yeah, because the commercialization wouldn't be a problem.
It would be a different dynamic. Yeah, yeah, thank you. Well, I mean, I think we've discussed a lot. So in closing, I think it might be nice to reflect a little bit more on the future. So you've shared your past, you've shared the various topics that you've been working on, but how do you see like the next 10 years in the IVF sector? What do you think are the big changes that are going to happen for patients in terms of technology, in terms of the organization of the sector, but also in terms of your own life and your role in it?
Brilliant question. So the last chapter of my book is all about the future of reproduction. And when I give talks, I normally talk about what's going to happen. Or one of my slides said, how will we make your children or your grandchildren? So I think there's a few amazing things that will happen. I think they're controversial, but I think at some point in the near future, we will make eggs from stem cells. When we make eggs from stem cells, that will totally change female reproduction. We won't be limited by our biology. We will still be limited by the costs. It will be expensive, but we theoretically could make thousands of eggs for any woman at any age. Genome editing is the sort of progression on from pre-implantation genetic testing. With pre-implantation genetic testing, we don't change the embryo. We just use the embryos that couple produce, and we see which ones are going to be free from the disease that they're transmitting at risk of. So with genome editing, we would actually, if the embryo had a disease gene, we just cut it out and put in a normal gene. And that extrapolates to lots of things. The baby doesn't have the eye color you want, or doesn't have other genes that the couple want. So again, we get into the finances with all of these, because they are all going to be expensive technologies. When they reach the clinic, they might not be expensive in the lab, but they will be by the time they get to the clinic. So you will have a class divide, and the wealthier people freezing eggs as well. You know, to freeze eggs is very expensive. So yeah, I think all of those things are going to come in. Egg freezing is still growing and growing, and it really worries me, the whole commercialization of it. I've really always been a supporter of egg freezing, and it's something I would have done in my early 30s when I was with a partner who wasn't ready to have kids. And I would have maybe had a very different life if I could have frozen my eggs. But I don't think it's plan A. I think, you know, I have this worry that we'll march our young girls off to the fertility clinic as soon as they graduate. And as I said, the fertility education is trying to keep people out. So those are the three technologies. The egg freezing is already here, but the other two are certainly bubbling under. And so for me, for my next 10 years, for me, it's all about educating, helping people to understand all of these technologies. We've got so much work to do. We've got all the school children now who in the UK have this on their curriculum, that we should teach about reproductive health. We should teach about pregnancy and menopause, etc. But then we've got all the people now who are left school to postmenopause, who don't know this. Most of them don't know this information, and we need to work with educating them so that they again can make an informed decision. And I'm doing this work globally. So there's some countries we work with who don't teach any sex education at all, never mind about reproductive health education. So we've definitely got 10 years of work there to keep me quiet and busy. But it is wonderful, and I'm working with amazing people. And so I'm really, really excited to be at this next phase. And I think the wonderful thing about the sorts of careers that you and I have is that they can evolve, and they can take different directions depending, you know, 10 years ago, I probably wouldn't have thought I'd be doing what I'm doing now. And we're always learning. Mm-hmm. I just love every day I'm learning something, learning from someone. So that's just absolutely amazing. And I've embraced social media. So I do quite a lot on social media, especially on Twitter. You know, I've had the odd comment about something, I'll just put it on. I realized that most of the schools I've been to don't have any period products in the toilets. So I, you know, come back with that thought, and you can just put it out on Twitter and say, Does anyone know any schools that have put period product? I have met one school since then, but it's very rare. So those sorts of things, being able to make a change for reproductive health, that's really, I'm very, very excited, very passionate about. So I'm very happy to be able to spend time working on that.
Oh, can I ask one last bonus question?
Yes, of course.
Well, I'm just thinking about, we've been talking a lot about fertility, but also your work is obviously broader. You work on menstruation, menopause, the whole fertile years, men and women. And I think, one of the major things that happened last week is the leaking of the opinion piece about Roe versus Wade, and the very likely possibility that abortion will be severely constricted in the US and potentially in other places in the world as well, and the rise of changes in the politics around the world that will affect reproductive freedom for women and also for men. So and we are in this field of assisted reproduction, which will likely also be affected by these developments, but at the same time sits alongside this kind of celebration of the mystery of the beginning of life that we started with, and at the same time the importance of reproductive autonomy and the freedom of choice that women have over their own body. So how do you navigate those developments and those politics in your work? And that will be the final question.
Oh, and it's a really tough one. I think we'd all say we sometimes do one step forward and two steps back, and I'm sure probably everyone listening to this will feel the same, that how can we in 2022 be going backwards like this? It's just unbelievable. I was watching one of the Louis Theroux's Forbidden America, and there was a guy he interviewed that said women shouldn't have the vote. I was just like, young guy, very, very influential young guy who's up and coming. And I just, wow, should women not have the vote? And the Taliban have just said that women, they've got to totally cover their whole face now. And you look around the world at these things and you think, wow. Oh, so we unfortunately still have a fight. We do have lots of things to celebrate in how women's rights have improved, certainly over my life, but there are still pockets of toxicity that are going on that we still, so we must never become complacent about this, and we need to keep up that fight to ensure. But yeah, some of them, I'm scared. I am a little bit scared of some of the things I've heard recently, and yeah, I really pray that we don't go backwards.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for your time, Joyce, and it was a pleasure to speak with you as always. I will now say goodbye to you, and thank you again.
Thank you so much, Lucy. Always a pleasure.